Hello, on the Daily Family. Welcome back to the podcast. Uh, it's been quite an eventful few weeks, I think, in the world on planet Earth. And this episode's going to be all about spiritual awakening. That word's been tossed around a lot. And it is a real thing, but some people are I think it's getting convoluted, as most things do, as most things do. So, this episode is all about a spiritual awakening, what it looks like, what it means. Are you in one? I'll tell you about mine. And also kind of just give some insight, wisdom, whatever you want to call it, into kind of some of the trends in like the spiritual side of the internet that I've been seeing. So if you feel like you're going a little nuts right now, if you feel like you're in the middle of a spiritual awakening, or if you already went through one, then this episode's going to be for you. Before we get into this episode, I just have to tell you that Break the Matrix, which is my deconditioning program through the lens of astrology, human design, neurolinguistics programming, and somatic healing, is open for registration. And this program is a 16-week program that's kind of a hybrid between self-led modules and live coaching. So there'll be live coaching calls with me and then self-led modules. It comes with a human design certification and also a lot of information on astrology, somatic healing, the rewiring of the subconscious mind through a neurolinguistics programming perspective. And so if you're on this kind of spiritual journey to come home to yourself, if you have been really wanting to kind of unlearn some of these programmed, conditioned patterns, maybe people pleasing, a weird relationship with money, a weird relationship with people, maybe self-doubt, self-shame, guilt, whatever it is, then this program is for you. It's 16 weeks long. And then there's also an optional retreat at the end that you can partake in, which is we are going to Costa Rica in October of 2025. And there are still a few rooms left for that. So if you want any information on either the program by itself or the program bundled with the retreat, which would make the program half off, go over to daniellemccleary.com/breakthematrix. That's daniellemccleary.com/breakthematrix. Okay. Spiritual awakenings. Let us dive in, shall we? What is a spiritual awakening? I think my best definition for what a spiritual awakening is kind of the beginning of breaking the matrix. Like, we live in a matrix, which is a set of pre-programmed, conditioned rules of society that we kind of come into, and we're conditioned from our parents and their parents, and where we grew up and how we grew up and the type of information that was being shared with us. Like, all of these things contribute to our programming, our conditioning, our patterning, right? And it exists in it's a matrix, and that sounds so Keanu Reeves, but without all of the Hollywood sci-fi, it's truly just what we perceive to be true through our own lens versus the infinite possibilities that exist in the quantum field, right? And that's metaphysics, that's actual science. So in metaphysics, in quantum physics, there is a law that states like there is the way that you perceive, and then there's infinite possibilities that can happen. Kind of like if you were to shine light at a mirror, that light, which you shine from one source, reflects out in infinite angles, infinite spectrums, infinite directions. That is how that's how thought is. That's how reality is shifted. So the way that I see something is not the way that you see something. The way that I was raised is not the way you were raised. What I believe is not what you believe. And even if we share beliefs, our lived experience is always going to be different because it is on an individual perspective. And the way that we see the world is our reality. So to say that it's not real is not true, because it is the reality in which you live, which makes it real for you. And I think there's a lot of terminology passed around like, oh, the 3D, the 4D, the 5D. And essentially, like, throughout history, we've gone through different evolutions of human consciousness. So, when humans first arrived on this planet, whenever you think that happened, right? Whether it was God created the world in 7 days, or like we were all originally from Mars and ended up here. It doesn't really matter. But throughout history, there's been an evolution of consciousness. And for a long time, there were no structures, right? There were social cues, and we've communicated with one another, but there was no construct throughout time and history. And the more that happened amongst the more the human population grew, more rules, more structure, more this is the way to do it and that is not the way to do it, which is very the 3D, right? There is the way that there is like what you think, and then there is the truth, and there's really no there's like no, it's not open for discussion. That's like the 3D. And I think as people have these like spiritual awakenings, what you start to realize, and I think where a lot of people are at now is like, oh, well, you have your truth and I have my truth, but we'll just agree to disagree. And I don't actually think that anybody is actually agreeing to anything. I think it's more people that are kind of caught in that are like, no, you have your truth and I have my truth. And we can agree to disagree, but like actually what I think is that I'm right and you're wrong. And like, we're just not going to talk about it. So it's more of an avoidance or a bypassing versus actually understanding that there are infinite possibilities and therefore infinite truths. And then I think this 5D consciousness that people talk about is when the human collective consciousness can get to the point where we understand that you have your way of looking at things and I have my way of looking at things, and neither one is less true than the other one, and there is a divine truth that we are all connected to. And you can call that God, you can call that source, you can call that the universe, you can call that whatever you want, but essentially there is like, we are all on our own little rivers and we're all flowing towards the same big, beautiful ocean, right? So it doesn't really matter if your river goes right then left, and my river goes straight, as long as we end up in the same truth, right? And I think that's where we're headed as a collective. We're starting to see that, like, you know, if we even talk from like a political space, like I grew up in Los Angeles, California. My lived reality growing up and dancing professionally in Los Angeles, California, driving through multiple different ecosocioeconomic, say that 10 times fast, ecosocioeconomic neighborhoods, so different demographics, different wealth classifications. I had to drive through like 6 of those to get to my dance studio growing up, right? So my lived reality of the human experience is very different than someone who was raised in the middle of Arkansas in a small town there's basically like one type of person. And neither one of those is less than. Neither one of those upbringings is worse than the other. They're different, and they each provide their own reality and their own input for the collective consciousness, right? And I think something that's starting to happen is that we're all starting to wake up to this fact. And, you know, Pluto just entered Aquarius, which Pluto is the planet of death and rebirth and transformation. And it just entered Aquarius, which is the sign of innovation, creation, but also universal truth and humanitarianism. So the collective over the next 18 years is really going to shift into this like a deeper understanding of one another, even with our differences. So it's not like we're all going to become more alike. That's not going to happen. What actually starts to happen is that people start to just understand that different lived realities is not less than, it's not worse. It just is, and it contributes to the collective consciousness. And the way that happens is through a spiritual awakening. So these happen in waves. And the reason they happen in waves is because if everybody on the planet just like woke up one day and like realized these like universal truths, right? That would be a lot of energy on the planet at once. And I'm not sure that everyone could like handle it. And a way that I really think about this I even think about this in terms of like the full disclosure of like UFOs and aliens, right? When I'm 37, when I was a kid in school, whether you quote believed in aliens was the same as whether you believed in ghosts. Like if you believed in aliens, that was taboo. And it's like, ooh, you believe in aliens. And it wasn't a universal truth, right? Um, and I think throughout time, there's been this slow drip of like, oh no, like it is real. And then the question then became like, well, how did they get here? How long have they been here? Are they already here? Like, are they here to hurt us? Are they not here to hurt us? Like, are they here to help us? We're not alone. Like, that's become such an understanding. And the reason I know this is like, I have an 8-year-old son, and we were watching this documentary on the National Geographic. It's called Ancient Aliens. I don't know if you've ever heard it or seen it, but we were watching this show, and it's all about like scientific proof that we are not alone, scientific proof that we've been supported by what appears to be like aliens for as long as the human race has been in existence. And it was so crazy because I looked over at my son and he's just watching this with a straight face. And I'm watching this like, this would have never been on television when I was a child. It was very much like a Mandela effect moment for me, where I was like, I'm losing my mind right now. Like, well, how is this just like on TV, on Nat Geo of all places, right? This isn't on like Gaia TV. This is on National Geographic. And so I like look over at my son and I was like, hey, oh, like in your school, like if you believe in aliens, is that weird? And he goes, what do you mean? And I was like, is there a discussion at school about whether aliens are real or not? And he goes, Mom, what are you talking about? Of course aliens are real. Like, we've seen pictures of them. Like, we've seen space, like they're in the air. We've seen photos. Like, of course aliens are real. And I just was like, oh my gosh, like there have been so many spiritual awakenings on the planet since I was a kid that now like the understanding that we are not alone is just common knowledge, which is so crazy. But that's like what spiritual awakenings do, but it can't all happen at once, because can you imagine if everybody just like woke up one day and was like, what? It would be too much to handle. So it comes in waves. So I want to talk about my spiritual awakening because it was crazy. So I've had a couple, but the really big one I had was in 2018. But I remember when I moved to London in 2007, and I got to London, and I remember being so shocked and like frustrated by the fact that my whole life I understood, or I felt that based on what we were told in America, that like how I had a preconceived notion of how other countries felt about us as Americans. And I had a preconceived notion as to how other countries viewed American as a world power, right? Like I had preconceived notions of that because I went through the history system and the school system. I was a public school student, if that matters, but I went through the public education system in America. So I get to London and I all of a sudden realize like, oh, so what I was taught to believe about how other countries viewed us is actually not correct. And what I was taught to believe about how other countries view our position in the world is not correct. And I remember being very frustrated by that. And I went down a huge rabbit hole around like American history, but through the eyes of the Brits. And I read a lot of like British history books where they tell American history. And it was so different than what I had been taught. And I was like, what? Like, it blew my mind. It frustrated me. I kind of went into a little bit of like mourning period around like everything I had known. And this was in 2007. So I was 19 at the time. And so then years go by, 2018 rolls around. And I remember like I went to bed one person and I woke up another. And I woke up the next morning and I remember being like, what is happening? And I started to question everything. Everything I used to believe about myself, about money, about relationships, about the world started to just crumble around me. And I went into kind of like a little bit of a depression. Like I kind of got very sad, but I also got very, I also was like a little bit paranoid for a little while. I was kind of afraid of everything. I was very much concerned that like, the government was just like a psyop, and like we were all in an experiment, and like they were all coming to hurt us. Like I was very convinced of that for a brief moment in time. And I remember there was this day, I've talked about this before, but it's called like the boot on the tire moment. Yeah, it's called the boot on the tire moment. I talk about it a lot, where I was in this like loop and this cycle with my life. And I remember feeling like I was hitting rock bottom. I was trying to save up because my son's birthday party was coming up, and I was trying to save up for it, but I was going to have to like ask my dad to help me pay for it. And I was working my ass off as a fitness instructor, teaching like 18 spin classes a week, barely making enough to pay the rent in LA, and just feeling like this can't be it. And then I parked my car on my street, and I got a boot on my tire because it was street. And I don't know if you know what a boot on the tire. It's like this little like clamp that like locks your tire in place, so you can't actually move your car until you pay this fine, which at the time was like $400 and something. And I couldn't afford that. Like there was no way. There was always more a month at the end of the money in my life at that time. And I had a breakdown. Like I had a full on mental and emotional breakdown. And I had to call my dad, and I had to ask him for the money so that I could get the boot off my tire so I could actually like go to work. And I was so upset. And I remember looking at Breezy, who was my girlfriend at the time. And I remember looking at her, and I was like, this will never happen again. Like from this moment on, like this is it. I went to bed that night, and I woke up an entirely different person. I woke up, and every excuse I had the day before, I no longer had. Every belief I had about myself and my relationship with money, my relationship with like hard work, my relationship with like who I was in the world had completely shattered. And it was scary. Like it was a really scary. I thought something was wrong with me. Like I even went down the road of like trying to self-diagnose like a mental disorder with myself. And this is nothing against people with like documented mental disorders. Like if you're neurodivergent, autistic, whatever, like this is not a commentary on that. I felt that that must be what's wrong. That must be what's going on with me, because I was so different than I was the day before. And it was like kind of light at that time. Like I remember it took a couple months, and then in the beginning of 2019, I like started my entrepreneurial journey, and like all of a sudden I went from having like no money at the end of the month to having like way more money than I needed at the end of the month. And I was actually like putting money in savings. And it was literally like I had jumped to a new timeline, which is what happened. I had literally quantum leaped to a new timeline in which the old one I existed on was no longer there. So this went on for a couple years, and then 2020 hit. And 2020 is when the pandemic started, which I don't know if you remember that, but it was crazy. The pandemic started, and I went down every rabbit hole you could have imagined. And listen, I'm also a 6'2" in human design. I am a stellium Sagittarius, so I am all about philosophy. I'm all about new ideas. I'm all about expanding my mind, learning new things. So if there is, everyone's like, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I love reading a conspiracy. Like, I'm not saying I'm a conspiracy theorist, but if there is a conspiracy for me to read, I am going to read it, because my thought has always been, if any of this shit actually comes true or actually is real, I'm not going to be the one that's like caught with my pants down being like, what? I had no idea. Like that could never be me. And so when the pandemic started and everybody was just like home and had a lot of time on their hands, the conspiracy theories went wild on the internet. I don't know if you remember that. TikTok was taking off. Everybody was like dancing on TikTok. And then in between dancing on TikTok and like learning how to make sourdough bread, they were like reading about how, celebrities are drinking children's blood. Like it was that was our day. That was what we did. That was a typical Tuesday. It was so crazy. And I remember like reading all of these things being like, what is going on in our world? Like, it's like, so let me get this straight. The politicians don't actually have our best interests, like two wings of the same bird. Like maybe these people aren't as good as we think they are, or maybe they're not as good as they hope that we think that they want us to believe that they are. Like it was just this constant, like, what if, 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 what if this is all a simulation? What if none of this is real? What if we're all not each other's enemy? What if, people aren't as bad as we're made to believe they are? What if it's the media that's actually the enemy? What if it's this? What if it's that? What if the good guys are actually the bad guys and the bad guys are actually the good guys? What if, what if, what if, what if? And it didn't matter at the time if any of that was, quote, true. What mattered is my brain was open. My ego was open. My intuition was open. And I was allowing massive amounts of information to come into my psyche. And what happens, I think, for everybody that goes through a spiritual awakening is there is a period of spiritual psychosis where you're just really open and you're like this sponge. So all of this information is just coming in and coming in and coming in. And I remember for a very brief period of time, sometime between 2018 and 2020, I remember feeling like everything was like evil, or there was like, it was like there was always like an ominous tone to everything. And it was like this kind of weird, like very subtle state of constant paranoia. And I think that's normal. I've actually come to see like the more people that I've seen and like supported through their own spiritual awakenings, I've almost like seen that that's kind of normal now, that you kind of have to go through that period because you're just like so much information is coming into you. And really like we were never meant to go through, have that much information come in, even before I started recording this podcast, I was talking to one of the podcast producers in the studio and we were talking about like how like as a millennial, we've seen shit that we should not have ever seen. Like in eighth grade, I watched humans jump from a burning building that had just been hit by an airplane. Like there was photos of when Osama bin Laden was killed by the SEAL team and like his, like it, like the wives and children being like murdered by these men. And like, whether that's right or wrong, like it was just a lot of information that the millennial generation has been, we've seen. And now every generation beyond that is the same. Like information is just immediate. Like something can happen and you will immediately find out about it. Right. So it's like, I even think about like, during like the TikTok ban that just happened, like the second it came back online, that news traveled through the internet like wildfire. So if you think about how quickly information travels, it's like when President Trump was shot earlier last year, it was immediately global news. It wasn't like that 20 years ago. It wasn't like that 30 years ago. And so I think with how fast information can travel in that way, you can almost just then realize like, oh my gosh, like spirituality and like, channeled messages, downloads, intuitive pings, those things also travel a lot faster than they used to. And it used to be that like somebody's spiritual awakening would take years. It would take 10 years. And now it's happening in like a very short amount of time. So I think people go through this like spiritual psychosis where you're almost just like in this trance and you're almost just like being guided by people who are also going through a spiritual awakening at the same time, which we're seeing a lot of on the internet right now. I'll get into that in a second. But anyway, so that did happen with me for a brief amount of time. And then all of a sudden you just get clear. And then you go, okay, I'm actually calm. So like now things that like stress out the rest of the world, an election, any like weird rumors going around on the internet, like I stay very calm because more than anything, I'm connected to my intuition. And I think that's what a spiritual awakening is. It's really you coming home to yourself because no matter where you're from, you're conditioned to look outside of yourself. You're conditioned to look to other people for the answers. Our politicians, our parents, our teachers, our mentors, our guides, our media, right? You're conditioned to look outside of yourself for the answers. And what I think a spiritual awakening does is it actually brings it back home to you and you come back home to your intuition. And that's not to say that you're not going to learn and you're not going to still like receive education, but there's a difference between learning from an educational perspective and taking on the thoughts and feelings and projections of the world around you. And I think that's what a spiritual awakening does, is it actually just like brings you home to yourself, and you really learn a lot about your own energy. You learn a lot about your own intuition. You learn a lot about what is real for you and what's not. So, okay. So that's a spiritual awakening. And on that note, I feel like we are on the verge of another one right now. And what started this actually, I think, is A, the election, and B, the TikTok thing. Let me explain. So the election happened, and for months, right? You had if you watched the news, it was like very, very, very clear that Democrats were going to win the election. Like everything that was being put on the news, everything that was being put in the polls, all of these early polls were stating that she was going to win it by a landslide. Kamala Harris was going to win it by a landslide. All of these things were happening. And so if you were tapped into the mainstream news, the mainstream media, if all of your friends were also saying the same thing, not only are you and that's what you wanted to happen, right? So let's say you are a Democrat on that, and I'm an independent. So this is coming from a very non-biased perspective. I'm an independent. And I just remember watching like my very liberal Democrat friends were very, very convinced that Kamala was going to win because of who they were talking to. All their friends agreed with them, and the media was confirming it. And that's called confirmation bias. That's what that's called. You believe something, you hear someone talks to you that also believes the same thing. Anything they say is now confirmation bias, and now you think that you just know, and that everything else is incorrect because you just know. And that happened a lot. And then the election obviously happened, and I think a lot of people who identify as Democrat really realized how off they've been with, a majority of the country. And like, listen, we could say it's a majority. I think, what was it? Kamala got like 75,000, Trump got like 77,000 or 73 and 78. I don't know. It was in terms of who voted, it was like a difference of, I think, like what, 73 to 78 million. So a difference of like 5 million votes, which is like, it's a lot of people, but not everybody voted. And not everybody was eligible to vote. So it's like, you could say that not over half voted for Trump, but either over half voted for Trump or they didn't care too much one way or another to come out and vote. Same thing we could say about Kamala. Like you could say that less than half voted for her, or you could just say like, no, it's not half because not everybody was calculated, but everyone else just like didn't care enough to vote. So like we can say that it like not caring enough means that they're just going to go with whatever happens. So that happened. And I think this was like a really big moment where people were like, wait, have I been off this whole time? Like, have I been lied to? Because some people that were watching the news at that time, they were like, oh my gosh, like shocked, like almost to the point where they were denying that it was possible. And then it's crazy because that's what was happening 4 years ago with the other side, right? Like all of the Republicans were saying that the election was false or like denying the election. And then it was happening again, but from the Democrat side. And I was watching this going, oh my gosh, this is the start of another awakening. And I believe that like everything is always happening, right? So like there's a universal law that states that like everything is always happening for you. Whether or not in the moment it feels like that is true, it is always happening for you. And sometimes like chaos needs to happen because the first step of a spiritual awakening is an initiation. And that initiation can come in the form of trauma, grief, death, or like a collective upset. Right. And so you think about like when the election happened, so millions, upwards of 70 million people woke up and realized that what they had thought to be true about the collective wasn't. And that a majority of people who voted for the other person. And that maybe everything they had read online was actually just confirmation bias, and realizing that like, maybe we're out of touch with actually what a majority of people in America want, which is an initiation. Because in that moment you go, has my whole life been a lie? Like, what is happening? Like, why am I feeling this way? I'm feeling really scared. And then, then there was this thing going around on TikTok, and it was called, I see like the spiritual side of TikTok all the time because I do a lot of astrology, and I obviously like am an intuitive. I'm a claircognizant and clairaudient and a little bit clairvoyant, and I do channel, and I am, I guess, I have spiritual intuition. So I see a lot of it. And there was this trend going around on TikTok called after the election leading up into the inauguration that was called the 4 a.m. Club. And it was called this, I think they were calling themselves the Blue Delulus, which I'm wearing bright blue right now. So shout out the blue. I was never one of you, but respect. There was this like this thing happening on TikTok, and it was people basically like spiritual guides, intuitive, spiritual mediums, psychic mediums, astrologers, tarot card readers, literally going on TikTok and being like, Trump will not be sworn in. Like, he's going to get arrested. Something's going to happen. And a lot of them were like, I don't know what's going to happen, but something's going to happen. And all of my guides and the cards and everything is telling me that he will not be sworn in, that something's going to happen. So then time went on, and then they had to certify the election, and Kamala did it. And a lot of those people were like, wait, I thought, and a lot of, and that's what that was what was happening. So there was like a lot of this Blue Delulu, like spiritual TikTok side of thing was like, they were saying that it was going to get to the certifying the election, and Kamala was going to like announce that he was under arrest, and it was all going to be over, and like it wasn't going to go past that date. Then that happened, and like not a single, obviously, not a single Democratic senator or House, not a single Republican Democratic senator or House or Republican like objected the certifying of the election. They all agreed that it was a fair and free election. And so again, people that had been following these spiritual teachers, and this was happening like in the media too, like if you watch certain like super left, super right wing media, like it's all bias, it's all confirmation bias, and they're paid to do that because the thing is, media does better when you're tapped in. And so if you feel confirmed in your beliefs watching something, you're going to keep watching it, and then their ratings are going to go up, and they're going to all get paid more. Like that's how it works. And so then the certification of the election happened, and then a lot of this like Blue Delulu crew was like, we've been like, no one's coming to save us. Like, you said that this was going to happen. And a lot of them fell off at that point and like started to wake up and like realize like that they were having this like spiritual psychosis. And then some of them didn't though, because some of these spiritual people came back on there and they're like, no, we got it wrong. It's the election. They're going to do that at the inauguration. At the inauguration, they're going to arrest him. And like, that's what's going to happen. And people bought it because again, confirmation bias. And I had done a TikTok kind of saying like, be careful who you take spiritual advice from during this time, because there's a huge wave. All of these initiations are happening, which are like initiating people into this next wave of spiritual awakenings, which is big. It's like going to be really, really big. And I think bigger than the one we saw in 2018, but this one's going to be really, really big. And I think a lot of the election, this Blue Delulu thing, like this was an initiation, because I think what people realize is like, oh my gosh, like I've been following somebody who believes the same thing as me. And like, sidebar. If you are a spiritual teacher, a psychic medium, if you are an astrologer, if you are a tarot card reader, if you work in the quantum or if you work in the healing space at all, your number one job is to be able to detach your personal bias from the work that you do. And if you have not done that, then there is shadow work for you to still do, because you cannot come into your work with spiritual or with personal bias, because then you are just going to project that bias outward. And somebody who has not gone through a spiritual awakening is just going to cling to every word you say and look for a savior, look outside of themselves for a savior, when actually they've been their own savior the whole time. And we saw that a lot with the spiritual community from during the election, after the election, leading up into inauguration. There was a lot of, and I don't hate on those people, by the way. I really don't, because I think the people giving the information and the people receiving the information were all going through a spiritual awakening at the same time. And I do believe that like you're on your own path, right? So you're going to be initiated however you're going to be initiated. So whether it was listening to your guides and then being terribly wrong and realizing that it wasn't actually your guides, but it was just your own bias the whole time, or listening to these spiritual teachers and being like, see, they're right. Like, I'm going to cling to that hope. And then realizing that you had just looked outside of yourself for the last year and a half. And like the initiation was you realizing you needed to come home to yourself and detach. Either way, you're on the spiritual awakening path and it's beautiful. And you're going to go through your dark night of the soul. You're going to do some shadow work. You're going to like question everything. You're going to go through a little bit of a spiritual psychosis. You're going to kind of have this like underlying paranoia, and then you will find clarity. And these are all the steps to a spiritual awakening. It starts with an initiation, then you question everything. So your childhood, your belief structure, how you were raised, the world around you, the government, like everything. You start to question everything. Then you get a little sad because you realize that a lot of things had been a lie and that like a lot of the way you'd been living your life was not actually like the way you were meant to live your life. And then you get a little bit of like fear around like, well, if that's not true, then what is real? And then you kind of have like trust issues. And then you probably fall into a little bit of a spiritual psychosis where you just like go on a search for information and you just want to read anything. So you're just like taking on way too much information that it's just this dopamine overdrive that just kind of puts you in this like state of psychosis. And I don't mean like psychosis in the way that like the Western medicine. I mean, like you've taken on too much information and now you don't even know what's real, like spiritual psychosis. That's part of the process. Then after that, a lot of those things start to fall off and then you kind of find clarity and you find discernment and then you actually find yourself in a very calm and neutral space no matter what happens. And it's not bypassing. It's just the trust that no matter what, we're moving the collective forward, right? So we saw a lot of that. And then the TikTok ban was another huge initiation. And it was interesting because anyone who had already gone through a spiritual awakening, like a lot of the people that I know, the community that I've found that we've all kind of went through that 2018 awakening, we were all talking about the TikTok ban. And I was like, we all know that this is just like theater, right? Like this has nothing to do with data. Like we all know that, right? Like we're all very clear. And they're like, yeah, totally. I'm like, this is all about like who gets to control the narrative. And they're like, right, totally. Because if you think about it, like TikTok got really popular really fast. Like with TikTok Shop, people started businesses. Over 7 million Americans make a full-time income on TikTok every year. That's crazy. And that's a lot of lack of control that the US government has. And I think, what I always thought was interesting was when Palestine and Gaza broke out, right? The US government was trying to go with a very pro-Israel stance. And that was very clear in the media. That was very clear in the news. That was very clear in the way that the politicians were speaking. And what was being talked about on TikTok was free Palestine. And this is not a commentary on like whose side I was on. Like, again, I take everything from a neutral perspective and I can see the trauma and like the generations of trauma and programming from both sides. And it was actually like, I actually felt a lot of empathy for everyone on both sides because it was just so prevalent that like there was so much fear. And I'm so glad that it's resolving itself as it should. I have friends and clients on both sides of on both sides of that. And I'm never going to be the person that's like, well, this is what I think, because again, I'm not there. All I can do is like console and support the people that I know that are going through it on both sides. But TikTok was very much being talked about free Palestine. And that spread like wildfire and went directly against what the original narrative that the US government was trying to put out. So then all of a sudden everyone had to backpedal and be like, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And I remember watching that going, oh, interesting. TikTok really like took that off. Same thing when all of the UFOs were in the air and like there were, drone footage being found like from, maybe a UFO, maybe it was military, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. If you watch the news or if you were on a Meta platform that was very obviously Meta is very much in cahoots with the US government and like what they want us to see, or at least they were at that time. I guess Mark Zuckerberg said that they're rolling back a lot of that like censorship stuff now that Trump is president, but I guess we'll see. But there was a very different story being told on Meta, like, or on the news or with the mainstream media. On TikTok, you could go see any video of a flying saucer. Like you could go see any UFO. You could go see any of those plasma things. There was like a whole trend going around like Dior bags, which was all Dior bags were like drones. Like it was all code, right? And that was being talked about freely on TikTok. And then all of a sudden now it's like, then the mainstream media has to like walk it back. And this is all initiation, right? So these are these moments so then TikTok gets announced that it's going down, and it goes down. And then less than 12 hours later, it comes back, which was comedy. It comes back, and there, you had like I think you had the left being like, this is all Trump. He started the ban, and then he is the one that took it away. This is a common tale, and it is a tale. That is a tale as old as time. Like, create the problem, offer the solution, save the day. Like, that's a tale as old as time, right? Like, that's a lot of our government has done that all the time. Like, they do that with illnesses. They do that with our food. They put the toxins in the food, and then they give us the medicine. Big Pharma gives us the pill to take care of it. Like, this is very much very on brand book of the United States. So everyone's saying that that's what like Trump did, because he was originally the one who like started the ban in 2020. But like what people weren't reporting, which again, confirmation bias, what people weren't reporting was, yeah, he did sign that executive order in 2020 because there was a data breach. And the fear was that data breach was going straight to China. They immediately found out that it wasn't going to China. And at the same time, TikTok partnered with a company here in Austin, Texas called Oracle, which is a data collection agency. And so from 2020, all of the data that TikTok collects from us was being collected here in the US, here in Austin, Texas. But nobody reports on that because that doesn't go with the narrative that like, this is all Trump's fault. And, that same executive order remained pretty unchanged until 2024 when Biden signed it. And then it makes you wonder, like, okay, so if the data breach isn't an issue actually, then what is it? And like, I think to anyone who's already gone through this like spiritual awakening, we can all see it very clearly of like, it's not a data issue. It's that on TikTok, they can't control the narrative, and like they want to control the narrative because the US could have very easily created higher, more strict data privacy laws in the US that would have prevented companies from taking our data and would have given American citizens the ability to own our own data more easily. But they didn't do that because why? Because the government still wants control over our data. Like, it's not that they don't want control over the data. It's that they want to be able to control the data. And if it was being collected by Oracle, then they couldn't. And like, that was very clear, but I don't think it was very clear to everybody right away. And it was like this huge thing. But then when it like came back online literally like 12 hours later, and like everyone like, and TikTok's like, thank you, Trump. I was like, oh, this is an initiation. This is the moment. There are people that had that happen and then all of a sudden went, wait, on both sides of the aisle, by the way, like not just Democrats, not just Republicans. It was literally just, and the only reason I use like politics a lot, because that is like the one main like division, right? Like there are the Democrats in America and there are the Republicans in America. And so it's really easy to kind of use that as like a reference point. But it's like with the TikTok ban, it's like the things that were typically Democrat were not happening. The things were typically Republican were not happening. This was like a bipartisan thing that was signed by both Congress and the Senate, both senators and congressmen on both sides of the aisle. And it was a moment that I think everyone was like, oh, wow. So like maybe the government doesn't care about us as much as we thought they did. And like, oh, if that's not true, then what else is true? So people are starting to go on this journey right now of like, well, let's learn more. Let's dive deeper. And this is a spiritual awakening. That's what it is. And what it leads to is a lot more understanding. It leads to a lot more love and support for your neighbor, even if you don't agree on things. Like I have so many friends, like we don't agree on everything. And it doesn't matter to me because as long as they're doing their work in the world and I'm doing my work in the world, we're all going to get to that like big blue, beautiful ocean eventually, that divine light we're all connected to. And whether my friend believes that is God or, I believe that it's like universal consciousness, it doesn't really matter. And I think that is the result of kind of doing this shadow work and understanding where your fears and your projections and your conditioning comes from and your programming comes from, kind of getting to know your shadows, not bypassing them, not avoiding them, but like facing them head on and being like, well, why does that trigger me? Well, why do I need people to agree with me? Well, why does this happen? And like actually doing the work and kind of transmuting any of those uncomfortable feelings of, feeling misunderstood, feeling not heard, feeling taken advantage of, but really like allowing yourself to have that moment the dark night of the soul is what it is. Then you can come out on the other side and you can actually realize like, I actually don't need people to agree with me. And it's okay if they don't. And if they don't, then that doesn't make them a bad person. It doesn't make me better or worse. It literally just means that we have different lived realities. And thank goodness that we all have these different realities that we can kind of bring together. So all this to be said, if you're in the middle of a spiritual awakening and you're kind of feeling a little crazy right now, like if you were one of those people that like really started to feel crazy, or that like your whole life's been a lie, or like maybe you were part of that like Blue Delulu crew and you like had this moment of like, what the fuck? You might be having a spiritual awakening, and like it's a really beautiful process. I'm actually very excited for you. I think that you're going to go through some tough moments, and it's super normal. Don't ever have that thought of like, oh, I'm so stupid. Like, why did I fall for that? That's not helpful for you. Like everything you're going through is exactly what you were meant to go through. Like every single thing you're going through is exactly the way it was meant to happen, and everything is always leading you to. It's leading you to your next timeline. It's leading you to your evolved consciousness. It really, really is. And so you, instead of like trying to swim uphill, or I guess upstream against the current and tiring yourself out, can you like roll over onto your back and just surrender and let yourself float and let yourself like move through any of these feelings and like any of these like wake up calls that you're having to come out on the other side? Because we're about to see a huge wave of awakenings happening. And Pluto's in Aquarius now. So Pluto's the planet of death and rebirth, and Aquarius is the sign of innovation, creativity, universal power toward, a humanitarian existence. So a lot of rebirth is going to happen. Old systems are going to crumble. The way that we thought things were is going to kind of get shifted around a lot. There's going to be a lot of transformation with tech over the next 18 years because Aquarius kind of rules like systems and tech and stuff like that as well. So I see like a whole new way of communicating online. Social media probably is going to take a whole new face. And then in the summer, to like even add to that, in the summer, Uranus, which is the planet that traditionally rules Aquarius, which is the planet of like kind of shock, but like innovation, like creative thinking, forward thinking, right? Like burn it down and start new energy, is moving into Gemini, which is the sign of the mind. It's the sign of communication. It rules the way that we communicate with one another. So you can think like those two coming together while Pluto's in Aquarius. In 2011, Uranus moved into Aries, and Aries is all about bold, innovation, leadership. And that's about when Instagram was taking off. So we saw a huge shift in the way that we communicated through Instagram. And then now it's moving into Gemini, which is all about communication. So I think that we're going to see a whole new way of social media. Maybe it's not even going to exist in the way that it does now. There's a lot of Web3 stuff happening. There's a lot of talk around like creating only platforms where people keep their data and the government keeps none of our data. I think all of those things are possible. Like I don't do the prediction thing. I just know that like these themes that we're having, they've been in history. Like the last time Pluto was in Aquarius, it was when all the revolutions happened. So, things are changing, and that's okay. And so with change and innovation comes spiritual awakening. And when it happens, it's really beautiful. Even if while you're going through it, it feels like everything is wrong and that you're losing your mind. You're not actually losing your mind. You're actually finding it again. So yay. Okay. If this served you, if you want to do a reading too, I do readings and they're currently half off. So a reading would be really good if you feel like you're in like kind of a spiritual awakening or you're starting one or finishing one. A reading's a really good thing because we can like dive into your chart and I can kind of look at like where all your transits are and we can really like talk through some of these things. So you can click the link in our show notes for that, or you can come into my DMs on Instagram, Danielle_on_the_daily, and I can give you the link for that. But as always, if you do love this show and you feel compelled, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and write us a little love note. It kind of works like the algorithm in other places. The more engagement we get, like the more likes, shares, 5-star reviews, stuff, the more that Apple will push my podcast out onto the charts. And that's really the goal. So if you love this show, I would love it if you could do that for me. And I'll see you next week. Love ya.